My name is Jerome Richardson. I'm with Bellevue University. We are conducting interviews with Vietnam veterans. We're at the 38th annual Nebraska Vietnam Veterans Convention, and we are here today with Bob. And we are here because Bob's agreed to share his experience and his story from his service in Vietnam. Bob, if we can start by you just giving your full name, where you were born, and your birth date, and a little bit of your family background.
Okay, my name's Robert A. Schleppenbach, Robert Anthony Schleppenbach. I'm the oldest of 11 children, 6 brothers and 4 sisters. My dad was a dentist. My mom was a stay-at-home mom. And I was born in Norfolk, Nebraska, raised in Pierce, Nebraska. And throughout my high school years, eventually heard about Vietnam, had people that I knew had gone to Vietnam and come back, had a second cousin that was the only one from Pierce that died, Irwin Polt. So when I got out of high school, I went to college, got through my freshman year, and into my sophomore year, I was playing in a band, local band, and with 5 days of classes and 3 days of finals left, I got a call from the band director and our band leader, and he said, "We've got a gig out in Boston. Can you go?" And I said, "Well, I've got 5 days of classes, 3 days of finals." He said, "Well, we need to know, if you can't go, we'll have to replace you." And so I said, "Well, I'll call the dean, see if I can take my classes, my finals early." And he said no. So I quit. And that Friday night, we had a basketball game between Pierce and Plainview, Nebraska. And at halftime, I told my dad and that I was going to Boston with the band and quitting college. And he didn't get real upset, but the one thing I remember is he said, "Well, that was a wasted $300. In the fall of 1969, tuition was $300 for tuition. And anyway, went out to Boston with the band, came back, didn't go back to college, got a job, and in less than 9 months got my selective service notice that I was drafted. And I was to report to Omaha on the 19th of what was my dates? 19th of August of 70. So that's when I was inducted. And then I flew out to Seattle to Fort Lewis, Washington, and did my basic and AIT there. And when I came back for a month before I went to Vietnam, no, it wasn't a month, it was a couple of weeks. I ended up taking a train from Columbus, Nebraska, back to Seattle. And then from there, we flew Tiger Airlines. I can remember the airplane. It was like 70 or 80 of us stuffed into this plane. And we flew up to Fairbanks or up into Alaska, and then from there to Yokota Air Force Base in Japan, and then from there to Da Nang. Once I got to Da Nang, we spent a week in, what do you want to call it, in preparing for your service, and then getting your record, you're getting your notice of where you're going to go. And
kind of in processing.
Yes, in processing. And I had a good friend of ours in basic training that we went through basic and AIT together. He got into administration and records, and he ended up getting 19 of us security platoon jobs at Phu Bai Base Camp up in Round Way by Camp Evans, for a lot of guys that know the area. And so my whole tour over there was pulling interior and exterior security. Exterior security was at night went out at 6 o'clock and you spent 12 hours walking around the interior of the base camp. And then the exterior was the same way. You went out to these towers, and there was a tower, and then 3 or 4 bunkers, and then another tower, and you spent from 6 at night until 6 in the morning pulling exterior security. And that was my main job for a number of months. We also had to watch a couple of Vietnamese would come in to pick up trash, and you had to be around, you had to be with them to watch them. And if somebody wanted to know what my closest experience to death over there was, it was in the base camp. These hooches that we stayed in, they didn't have skirts around the bottom. They were just on 4x4 stilts, about 30 inches off the ground. And these 2 Vietnamese were walking around picking up trash, and I had actually been in a hooch with 8 other guys. We had 8 little cubicles, and about 5 or 6 months in country, our staff sergeant, he had a whole half of a hooch, and part of that half, he let another GI stay with him in it. So he was on one side and the staff sergeant was on the other side. Well, the one guy that was with the staff sergeant left. He got out of the service, and the staff sergeant asked me if I wanted to come in with him, and I said sure, why not. So when I got my stuff into the hooch, he said, well, I'm moving from this side to the other side, so you can have where I was at. So I set up everything on that side. Well, we were walking around with the 2 Vietnamese picking up trash one day, and we got to my hooch, and all of a sudden one of the Vietnamese, he started getting excited and saying, GI, GI, beaucoup bad over there, and he was pointing down underneath my hooch, right under my bunk, and there was a milk carton with a hand grenade inside with the pin pulled, and I had been sleeping on top of that for about a week. Well, it was intended for that staff sergeant, and we got lucky, we disposed of it, but that's, as far as the closest to getting injured, that's probably the closest I ever got. We did have gooks would come out of the village and go into the Piedmonts, find their mortars, and they'd mortar the base camp and just kind of harass us, but never really got very close to anything hitting us. I think the mess hall one time, but other than that, that was my time pulling security. And then about 7 months in, I got called in by our brigade commander, Commander Ware was his name, W-A-R-E, I think, and he wanted to have 3 of us become bodyguards for him and go out in front when we'd go up to an observation point. And this was the rainy season, so we weren't able to go out by helicopter, so we put an M60 mounted it on a Jeep, and we would lead him out to the observation points and for security. And we did that for 3 months, and it was probably the easiest job we had, because we reported to the sergeant major in the morning, and if there was nothing that the colonel was doing, we had the rest of the day off. So he went out about 3 times during that 3 months, but I would go out I had a zoom lens on a Canon camera, and I'd go back behind the brigade headquarters onto the tarmac, and I would film some of these loaches and Hueys coming in for various reasons. And there was one time one of those loaches came in, and he was clear across the tarmac, and I was looking through my zoom lens and was going to get a picture, and I saw him go like this, and I looked over my camera and looked up in there, and I guess it's you. Come over here. So I went over there, and he asked me what I was doing. And I said, well, I'm just taking some pictures and got the day off. And he says, well, I'm going up to the DMZ to a camp up there to take mail. Would you be interested in coming with me? And I said, well, when are you going to be back? And he said, well, I just will an hour up and a couple hours, there and back. So I said, absolutely. So I was able to sit in the side seat there and fly with him up to the camp up there at the DMZ and fly along the ocean there. What was the ocean? The
Chinese.
South China Sea.
Yeah.
And now that one thing I remember is we were flying along about, 120 knots. Might be wrong, but we were flying along pretty good. And all of a sudden he taps my shoulder and he points up, and there was a shit hook. A shin hook. We called him a shit hook. And he was just blowing our doors off. And I said, gee, Merry Christmas, how fast is that thing going? He says, it's the fastest helicopter in the service. I think 180 knots or something. Maybe I'm way off, but just the disparity between the chopper that we were in and that Chinook, just amazed me. But we came back, and that was an experience. Let's see, once we were over there for a while, we didn't have any squads that would go out into the Piedmonts, and we did have an LT came out of Shavetail School, second lieutenant, came in all gung-ho, and you could tell he was itching to get his combat infantry badge. And he went to the colonel and convinced him to set up a squad to go out into the Piedmonts early evening, and then set up in various places and sit and watch for gooks coming out of the village. And they would sometimes find their caves and get in, and that's where they would have their mortars and things that they would harass the base camp with. So we were supposed to go out and try and look for any that might be coming out of the village. Can't say as we ever saw anyone. We thought we saw one going into a pagoda one time, but we went down there and couldn't find it. But in probably a month of doing that, we never had any skirmishes. What amazed me was that the LT wanted to make sure our equipment was operating properly, so every night we would have a time where we would have a mad minute. And I don't know if you know what a mad minute was. We would take and fire our weapon for a minute. And most everybody had an M16, and I was carrying an M60. And you just sat there and fired into nothing for a minute just to make sure your equipment was operating right. Other than that, I was going to go. Well, actually, I came home for a couple of weeks. Came clear back to Nebraska, and spent time at home. Helped firefighters put out a fire at a lumber yard that I had worked at when I was a kid. Ended up going back, and a couple of months later I had planned on going to Taipei, where one of my mother's aunts was a nun. She was a nun in Taipei, what do you want to call them, lifelong, she stayed there for her life in service of these people.
Kind of like a monk would do.
Yeah. Anyway, I had planned on going, and because I had written back letters to the folks that when my tour was up, I was going to re-up for another 6 months so I could get out of my 2-year commitment 6 months early. Well, it came down to towards the end there, and I got notice that I was, somewhere in my paperwork, it explains that I had gotten a 2-week early out of my year tour. So I canceled the tour, my trip to Taiwan or Taipei, and did plan to come home. And of course, you're getting down close to 2 weeks, and I don't know, maybe most guys remember that we're over there. You had a short timers calendar, and when you got down to a month, you cut off, you marked off every day, and when you got down to a week, you were a short timer. You were so short you had to stand on a nickel to piss on a dime. I'll never forget that.
We always said it was GMA. 3 more days GMA.
Yeah. And so anyway, I got my 2 weeks early out, and when I flew back to Seattle, I had a buddy of mine I was in college with, and he was in San Francisco, and it was the end of January, and it was a couple of days before Super Bowl. So I flew down to San Francisco, watched the Super Bowl with him, and spent a couple of days there. And then after that, I flew to Omaha, and I had an aunt. My mom's sister lived in Omaha, and when I flew into Omaha, I called her, and I told her I'm coming back 2 weeks early, and the folks don't know it. And so there was a company called Abler Transfer from Norfolk that did day runs back and forth from Omaha to Norfolk, and she called one of them, and they were going back. One of the drivers was going back in the afternoon, so my aunt Joe picked me up, and we ate some lunch, and then she took me to the location where he was at, and put everything in his truck, headed back to Norfolk, Nebraska. And on the way back, he said, how are you going to get from Norfolk to Pierce? 14 miles, I think, to Pierce. He said, no problem. I'll just hitch a ride. A lot of good people will give me a ride. And before we got back, he said, I'll just take you back when we get back. It's no problem. So I threw my stuff in the back of his pickup, and got to my house, said thank you, what I owe you. He says, oh, you're kidding me? You're a veteran. You just served your country, and just get out of here. So I went into the house, and I had a young brother that was in the basement, and I went like this, shh, don't say anything. And his eyes were wide because they weren't expecting me for a while. Anyway, I walked upstairs, 13 steps up to the kitchen, went around the corner. And my mom saw me and about dropped to the floor. She was so excited. And I have a picture in my stuff here where she came up and was hugging me. I grabbed a camera right away and got a picture of her hugging me. But they weren't expecting me back for a couple of weeks. So I spent, I think I spent a month at home. Bought a 73 Camaro, Aztec Gold. And at the end of that month, I went to East Dubuque, Illinois, and picked up a buddy of mine I was over there with, and we drove down to Fort Benning, Georgia, to process out, and spent a month there basically doing nothing. There's a lot of GIs experienced when they processed out, and at the end of that month I got my notice that I was going to be given my DD-214, and I was going to get 6 months early out of my 2-year draft commitment. And so I ended up spending 18 months and 1 day in that man's army. And that was pretty much my experience as I can recall it.
Well, let's do a little backtracking because you covered everything from A to Z, so that was pretty neat. Let's hit just a few highlights. Basic training. We all have something that's in us forever and ever and ever and ever. What couple of things do you have that's part of your life right now that was introduced to you in basic training?
Well, I'd have to say my drill sergeant was looking for my glasses.
They're on your face right now.
Well, they are. Okay, all right. Wow.
That's all right.
It's like, where's my glasses? You know? Oh, is this going to be on film?
No, we'll take it.
You'll edit it out. Anyway, my drill sergeant was a great guy. We knew right away he wasn't going to be kicking our ass all the time and being, a real a-hole. He wanted us to learn. He wanted us to train. He wanted us to be in shape, and he wanted us to know what we were doing. So we did experience the Army situations where everybody had to do things, everybody had to be alike. And at Fort Lewis, Washington, you had weather conditions that went from nice to crappy. Even in October and November, it would turn from rain to snow just in the crack of a short period of time. Well, a guy came out of we had all of our coats and warm equipment on one morning, and a guy comes out without his warm jacket on, and we thought, okay, well, drill sergeant's going to send him back to get his jacket. No, everybody had to take theirs off so we could be alike. So we're doing all our calisthenics and all our drills and everything, our marches, without warm jackets on. And so obviously we were a little PO'd at this one guy. I don't know if we short-sheeted his bed that night or not, but somebody probably did something. But the training was, back when you're 19 years old, you're in relatively pretty good shape. Most of us were. I can't say as we had anything negative as far as my basic training. AIT, I can remember going. Everybody had to pull KP in basic, and you get up at 3 o'clock in the morning and go in, and you're prepping for everybody coming in for breakfast, helping the cooks, and then you're working all day long in the kitchen and cleaning up, and later on and after supper you're helping maybe the cook do various things after that, cleaning behind stoves, etc. When we got into AIT, if you became a squad leader, in the past we had heard you didn't have to pull KP. And I don't know if the rest of this story I should tell, but when we got into AIT, they took that option away. They took that benefit away from the squad leaders. So I was a squad leader and thought, okay, good. Well, we ended up having to all pull KP. Well, there was one day we went into KP, 3-4 o'clock in the morning, and spent the whole day doing what we needed to do. And about 7:30 at night, we had everything cleaned up. Kitchen was back to where it was supposed to be, and there was 3 of us were going to go out the back door, and in comes one of the bakers, and he says, "Where do you guys think you're going?" And we said, "Well, we're done for the day. Everything's back where it's supposed to be." And he said, "No, you're not. You're going to help us." He says, "I need to do some baking, and there's some things I need done." And he found things for us to do, like behind the stove where it sometimes doesn't get to. Well, we were so upset. He was baking pies, and there was still a bucket of cigarette butts and that had been in a, that hadn't been, we were going to take them out into the trash. Well, he had these big 5-gallon buckets of cherry mix for the pies, and when he wasn't looking, we took those cigarette butts and dumped them into that cherry mix and mixed it up real quick, so he couldn't see that. And we don't know what happened after that, but I'm sure this was for the officers, these pies. And so somewhere some officer was eating a piece of pie and came across something and figured, saw that it was a cigarette butt. But nothing ever came of it with us, so we got away with it. Other than that, I went through AIT and took mortar training, 11 Charlie. Did not use that when I went over to Vietnam, of course, because I was at a base camp with security. So.
All right. Coming back home to the States, what was that like? I know there's a lot of stories, and a lot of them are good because of the opposition that we had throughout the nation on the war itself. But what was it like for you coming back home? When I
flew back into the States and then down to San Francisco, I wore my civilian clothes. So I wasn't there, but nobody knew I was in the service. And then back to Omaha, I was the same. When I got back to Norfolk, Nebraska, and Raxta Pierce, where I grew up, everybody was good to you because it was a farming community. We were very patriotic, and I don't remember anybody ever having any problems with anybody that didn't like the Vietnam campaign, to tell you the truth. I don't remember talking to any of my buddies that were over there that had experiences back home. So,
in your transition, the overall experience, did it benefit you looking for work and figuring out what you want to do, or did you feel like it slowed you down some?
Actually, no. I grew up. I turned 21 over there, and really when I went to college, I didn't know what I was going to do. I was proficient in music, so I took music as a major. Changed my major my sophomore year, which didn't make any sense. And then, of course, when I got back from that gig, I didn't go back to college. When I got back home, I just got a job working for a friend of mine's dad, working in construction building. He was in a welding shop. Worked there until I got a job in Omaha, or Lincoln actually, building prefab homes. Worked there for less than a year because in less than a year after getting back, when I had that Camaro, I lost my driver's license on points. And so living in Lincoln, it was tough to get to work, so I moved back to Pierce, where I could stay with my parents and then walk to work at that lumber yard that I had helped put out the fire. And while I was working there, a friend of mine and his dad came in, and a friend of mine from high school, and got to talking about how they needed somebody to help them out on the farm, and would you like to come help us? And I said, well, I don't get my license back for like 6 months. And my best friend says, well, I'll come pick you up every day. So to make a long story short, I started working for them out on the farm. And that first year, they had a couple of smaller trucks, twin screws, and that first year they bought a tractor trailer so we could haul corn to the different locations around. And anyway, I learned to drive that truck and got to love it. And after working with this farming operation for, I think, 8 years or so, I bought that truck and was independent hauling grain for a while. And after that, I went and bought my own truck, another new truck, and then went over the road and I just got to loving driving truck, and never went back to college, but just continued to get trucking jobs over the next 40. Well, I've been at it 48 years, but I've been doing that for that many years. I guess that my Army service didn't really influence me into that area. My experience after I got back took me to that direction, I guess. But I grew up in the Army. There's no doubt about it. I was proud to serve. I knew a lot of guys that were not what you'd call upwardly mobile, when I got out of the service, and never could really. My dad's example was my example. He worked as a dentist, sold Hamilton funds on the side to support our college education, 11 of us. And then, of course, Mom was a stay-at-home mom, but that example set me on the path of never really sitting around doing nothing. And so, I worked Monday through Friday, balls to the wall, when I was trucking, and that's basically what I got out of the service. I don't know what I would have done if I wouldn't have gone into the service. It's hard to say.
10 other siblings. Did any others join?
Actually, my one of my younger sisters, she went to dental, become an dental assistant, dental tech, and because my dad had the influence being a dentist, and she worked for that a little bit in Lincoln, and then went back to school to become a lawyer, an attorney, a lawyer, and ended up meeting a guy who was in the service, and he had gone to the Gulf War, the first Gulf War, and when she became an attorney, she went and enlisted into the Army and was in the JAG for, I don't know if it was 4 years or so.
Okay.
So that was...
So you and your sister.
Yep, my sister. That was it.
And in talking to you early, you mentioned your dad served in World War II.
He did.
On top of everything else. So I'm just curious, from a large family, did your relationship, I would imagine, but don't want to assume, get strengthened by your service with your dad and you having that kind of shared background?
I'd say he shared his service because he never had to go overseas, so he couldn't really experience what I experienced. But we never really had a close relationship. He was one that wanted us all to go to college, and I think out of 11 of us, I'm the only one that didn't go to finish college, and that kind of bugged him in a way. But we'd have conversations about things that I experienced over there, things that he experienced. He went through accelerated schooling to become a dentist, and he would work on some of the POWs that they had brought from Germany.
Yep.
He would work on them, and a lot of his training was on these soldiers. He never said whether he had fun making them hurt or not. But you kind of assume that. Anyway, yeah, his service was totally different than mine, and we never really talked about it. We had good times where we would take pictures of our cap and our jacket, our
kind of comparison photos.
Yeah, comparison photos, and the fact that he could still fit into his, 40, 50 years later or whatever. So he's proud of that.
You have children?
I have 3.
And any of them follow in your footsteps?
No, they did not. Nope. My youngest son died when he was 2. My next daughter, she actually went into college into a double major, business and political science, and became very adept at learning about politics and how it related to the Vietnam War and how political the Vietnam War was. You know, as we all know, a lot of contractors, military contractors, made a lot of money because of the war, and she's very knowledgeable about the politics of the war.
Absolutely.
And otherwise, my youngest son, never had a desire to go into the military. Just went into medicine, working here at Omaha in surgery at Omaha, the hospital.
On base?
No, here in the main hospital here in Omaha.
Yeah.
Nebraska Med Center?
Nebraska Med, the
Yeah.
Med Center, yeah.
And
Like I said, I'd make a terrible talk show host, trying to put my thoughts into words, but so.
the trying to think if from our conversations we covered pretty much everything. There was a short bit of training that you had radar wise. You got to Saigon.
Yes, in reading, I have a whole folder here of all the letters that my mom kept. Every letter that I kept from basic training all the way until I told them at the very end that I was going to re-up so I could get an early out. And in that, I was able to remember that I just wasn't in the 101st Brigade Airborne Division in Vietnam, that I was in the 2nd Brigade, because I got Trooper of the Month one month and had to spend time with the colonel, and then he took us around all the different platoons and all the different, I got to meet all the brass,
Yeah.
and I'm as nervous as a long-tailed cat in a room full of rocking chairs. Didn't really enjoy that very much, but I was able to. My folks got a letter from the colonel, addressed U.S. Army or something like that, and I sent them a letter. I said, "Don't get excited if you get a letter with that heading on it, and everything's fine. I just got Trooper of the Day." So that was an experience. I don't know why I got it. They just picked somebody, I think. But then I also did 1 week of radar training, radar school in Saigon. And I didn't use it. But
Well, you covered. I think we covered everything, and I want you to know how much we appreciate you sharing your story.
absolutely.
I love the fact that you surprised your mom going home. I don't know what it is about GIs, but we always seem to try to surprise our parents, and sometimes it works. Sometimes somebody dimes you out, but I could tell it worked for you.
Well, it worked. I'm just glad she didn't faint and fall, and I had to try to catch her.
Yeah. Is there
Yeah.
any final words that you would like to share, knowing that your great-grandkids, your grandkids might look at this, some student might be on there doing some research about the Vietnam War, learning about your experiences of somebody who was drafted into service? Anything you would like to share to somebody watching your video?
Well, I'd have to say military service is something everybody should do, whether it's just in the reserves or the National Guard, or getting in to become doing it for a career. A lot of times, a lot of things now, you can go in and pick your MOS and do what you get some training, good education. You'll get out, and I think most of the time you get your education paid for. If you're questioning on what you want to do after high school, just don't jump into college and waste time doing getting basic classes. A lot of guys, people go into college, spend a couple of terms or a couple of years taking classes, and then don't know what they're going to do with it. You know, you could have gone into the service and possibly found your niche. You know, a lot of opportunities in the service. And so if I was to suggest to my kids and my grandkids, don't hesitate to talk to a recruiter at least and find out what opportunities there are in the service. Because I think everybody should do some service to their country, whether it be the National Guard, Reserves, or active duty. So,
Thank you very much. I think a lot of people, especially our team, would appreciate that, because many of us share that, and I agree with you, and I appreciate your service, especially under the conditions in which you served. You still saw the good to that, and that's pretty neat.
well, I always tell people when they say thank you for your service, and it's just kind of a thing that I say. I said, well, I had no choice. I was drafted. And most people, they say, well, at least you went in and served. You didn't go to Canada.
Yeah.
You know.
No, it means a lot that you do that and set an example for if we should ever have to call on our next generation. There's examples of people who set aside to do something greater than themselves.
Yeah. You know, and the thing about my service, I can remember over the years thinking, you know, I really had it so easy over there. And when we would go various places with some of my friends that were over there that were in the bush that had a really hard time, and they didn't talk about it. My cousin, several other friends, they just would not talk about it. And there was one time we were visiting the memorial, the traveling Vietnam memorial. It was in Tilden, Nebraska. And there was a lady there handing out the pins, you know, the welcome home pin. And a friend of mine, Monty Zerke, was next to me, and she was handing out the pins, and I said, I don't really deserve it. I didn't have a tough time over there. And my Monty grabbed me by the collar, and he shook me, and he says, listen, he says, it took 9 of you to support us, one of us in the bush. Don't you ever degrade your service, because everybody had to do something. So, you know, well, no matter what you do in the service, just remember, you're supporting somebody.
Now, we are going to take pictures of what you brought.
Okay.
But is there anything there that you would like to share on the film?
Well, the only thing, on my hat, I've got those campaign ribbons. I've got the service medal, Vietnam service medal, the campaign ribbon, and then I've got the combat infantry badge, and that's pretty much what I did as far as getting medals.
Yeah.
Don't have the big ribbons like everybody else. But,
yeah, I do see the National Defense Medal as well.
Right.
So,
yeah. Yep.
Fantastic. Well, thank you very much, and that would conclude us.
Absolutely. Thank you.